I have been a feminist since my late teens. I have no doubt whatsoever that the deepest discrimination, not only in this society but on this planet, is against women. I have learnt on my feminist journey of the deep discrimination faced by other groups in society. I know that I belong to the majority group that is discriminated against, and I know in most instances they belong to the minority groups. The reason we have a coalition is because those interests, those people who come from the groups who suffer some of the worst discrimination in our society came together a long time ago to share each other's oppression, to understand it, and to look for common cause. I come from a part of this island which has been riven by discrimination for generations. The politically controversial discrimination is on the basis of religion and politics, but I also know as a feminist that the most outrageous of discrimination on this island has been against women, whether they be Indigenous Irish women or whether they be women of different races, whether they be able-bodied or disabled, whether they be young women or older women, whether they be women with caring responsibilities, independence, or without them, then that is the all-pervasive discrimination in this society. And it used to be permissible to say those sort of things out loud when I first became involved in the world of work, when I first became a trade unionist. It was permissible for governments to legislate, and indeed even the representatives of the movement who were male, to say that married women shouldn't work because they were taking up the space that really belonged to young men who were coming into the workplace. That part-time women workers should absolutely not have the same rights as real workers. That issues on reproduction, that issues on equality, that issues on sexual abuse, that none of those things were relevant to the agenda. We weren't about that. But actually, I belong to a movement that has always been about the underdog, the disadvantaged, the oppressed, and doing something about confronting and challenging that. So we've been on the issue of equality and human rights for a very long time. And the first thing I'd say to you is we believe that the framework we should be talking about is an equality and human rights framework. And it's not just about a budget, it is about a programme for government, whatever the investment strategy and whatever the budget looks like. They're not standalone. I mean, you don't work out a budget without trying to work out a plan, first of all, as to what you want to do with what you've got. So these things are intimately connected, and we're on the same mission on both parts of the island. We want our respective governments to develop those kind of frameworks and to stop doing what they're doing, which is causing more harm to the most disadvantaged people in society across the island, where the gap between rich and poor, the equality gap, is rising. And the one thing that we know is that history tells us that every time there is an economic crisis, then discrimination, intolerance, and bigotry rises. Hasn't been eliminated, but it rises. The current situation in the north is very clear evidence that that is the case. We've just recently produced the information on our child poverty levels. No surprise to you. All these things tend to be measured in a UK context. We're trying through a new economic institute that has been set up by the trade union movement to start measuring these things properly on an All-Ireland basis as well. But the North of Ireland has indeed the highest rates of child poverty in a UK context, and it has twice the rate of the deepest, most acute child poverty. And that's just an example. But why is all this important? We had high hopes. We've always had high hopes that we could get to a place where we lived in a society that was just and that was fair. We've always known that the way in which we need to do that is to develop strategies that are based on equality and human rights. The 20-year campaign I'm talking about, very quickly, is actually a campaign that starts back in the 70s when we're campaigning to get anti-discrimination laws. And in the North, we're going to benefit from the fact that Europe takes decisions, states are required to introduce anti-discrimination laws, and we get 76 where we finally get sex discrimination laws and an Equal Pay Act, but they stall its implementation for another 5 years. What Europe's not doing is also saying states will introduce laws that will outlaw issues such as discrimination on the basis of religion and politics. So that's another campaign that's running parallel. And those laws do come in the mid-70s in Northern Ireland. And my first public service job was working for the Equal Opportunities Commission for Northern Ireland. And I wasn't in it for very long before I found out that it was utterly and totally failing to do its job. It took 2 years, very active campaign inside the workplace and with the trade union movement to deconstruct the Equal Opportunities Commission, reconstruct it, and it did become for about 20 years a strong enforcement agency. It cost me my job, but that was kind of going to be inevitable. I did go back to that commission about maybe 8 years later as its deputy chairperson, and I served during its strong enforcement period for about 8 years. So I have an intimate knowledge outside and inside of how these things ought to work and how a society can be so deeply improved if there was a genuine political commitment to looking after the most disadvantaged, ensuring their rights, and in our case in the North, underpinning a peace process with equality and human rights, because there isn't one without it. There is no shared society without it, and we're very clear about that. We're also very clear that there is a complete move away at the moment from any attention, and I believe in both parts of this island, any attention on the areas and groups of greatest disadvantage. And that's a very dangerous space for us to be in, because the areas and groups of greatest disadvantage are increasing as we speak. And the decisions that are being taken by the political systems in both parts of the island are compounding the disadvantage, and they're deepening it. And there's one hell of an evidence base for that. But let me give you the most acute one in the North, 15 years into the Good Friday Agreement. We currently have now got a greater gap in life expectancy for the most disadvantaged people in our society than we did 15 years ago when that agreement was signed. We currently have a higher rate of premature death for the people in the most disadvantaged groups than we did before we got devolved government in 2001. And our burgeoning suicide rates are dominated by long-term unemployed people from the areas and groups of greatest disadvantage. So our mission was to get a framework, get equality tools, get human rights tools, convince that these things should be at the heart of government, the programme for government, the budget should be constructed to address all of the patterns of discrimination that would bring us to a reverse situation on those outcomes. And our reality is that is where we are today. So this is a long haul, this is a difficult campaign, this is a long fight. And I'm looking at some of these lovely young faces in the room and thinking, I look like that when I was so be prepared, but don't stop. That campaign is characterised by building alliances and allegiances, using the best possible expertise that's out there, who's thinking the same way we are. And I'll give little bits and pieces of examples of that. This is 1996. Professor Christopher McCrudden with the CAJ, which is our human rights NGO, with Unison, which is a trade union that takes all of this really seriously, producing the arguments for moving to a statutory obligation on government to promote equality of opportunity, and also the human rights arguments. This is 1996, sorry, this is 96, this is 97. And this is the kind of, these are discussion documents accompanied by large seminars with all sorts of groups in civic society, with being putting pressure on government officials and others to come into the room to be part of these discussions. This is mainstreaming fairness, which is, you know, the next contribution to the debate. This is 1998, the year of the Good Friday Agreement. And what you see is all of the work we've tried to do as allies and coalitions finally making its way in to the Good Friday Agreement as sets of commitments on equality and human rights, and then translating their way into the 1998 Northern Ireland Act as the clauses that establish new equality tools, in particular Section 75, and then I'll do a bit more detail on that, but also establish our human rights obligations, and that establish the human rights institutions. And may I be absolutely clear, there is no space on this island for the merger of the equality bodies and the human rights bodies. The human rights bodies need to be independent, internationally recognised, standalone, and they are linked not only to European obligations and to the domestic requirements on states to establish those bodies, they are linked to the Good Friday Agreement, signed by two international parties, the Irish government and the British government. And you really need to start a campaign. You know, it's looking pretty late, they've announced the shadow body, but it's not on, and I do think it's probably some very serious legal infringement, and maybe the infringement proceedings is something people should think about. We did a lot of work as two organisations, CAJ, Unison, on the Good Friday Agreement and what we believe the equality and human rights provisions were. That's a write-up of a conference that involved Mary Robinson, Christopher McCrudden again, and all sort of organisations who are our allies, the organisations representing women, representing ethnic minorities, representing loyalist, nationalist, Republican, unionist communities, the organisations representing disability, the organisations representing LGBT sectors, the organisations representing children and older people. And we've got all sorts of framework groups and coalitions around that. So our coalition is actually about 80 coalitions coming together on this. It's a big part of civic society. We come to some very detailed work the coalition then does on what the law should look like. We get to a place where we've got the law, and we then start looking at how it should be delivered, and how things like the programme for government and the budget and all of that should change, and what are the key things in our society. It's not going to change overnight. It's going to take a long time to disturb the existing patterns of discrimination, and back in 1998 we know that. You cannot be part of such a deeply divided, distinctly discriminatory society and think that it's going to change overnight. So what you're looking at is the hope of a programme that's put in place based on equality and human rights is going to bring us to another place. And I've told you what we're like 15 years on, not there. But that does not mean we don't stop. The role of the Equality Coalition is to keep on this agenda and keep at it. We had big reservations about the establishment of the Equality Commission back in the year 2000 because they merged together our other anti-discrimination bodies, which were the bodies that were dealing with gender discrimination, with religion and politics, and we just got the one that was dealing with disabilities at that stage, disabilities and race at that stage. Can you imagine? We did not have any anti-race discrimination laws in the north of Ireland. until a few years ago, because apparently we didn't need them. So we weren't racist. But they melded them all together, and we had a genuine fear as a coalition that somebody's oppression would dominate everybody else's, and we rather suspected it was going to be religion and politics. I have to tell you, it's a hell of a disappointment 12 years later to say that nobody's oppression is dominating the agenda. In fact, we're not entirely sure that equality or the pursuit of it is dominating that agenda anymore, and that's a critical place we're in. So that's the current role, and we've just most recently been engaging directly with the enforcement body to say, what have you done? You've got the tools, you've got enforcement powers, what have you done to stop what's happening in the society that promised that equality and human rights would be at the core of it? That's depressing, but there's hope. So I'm going to hand over to Emma, who's going to talk a bit about that particular tool that is Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act. And then I'll wind up and I'll tell you what we've learned.
Hi everyone, I'm Emma Patterson. I coordinate the coalition, but I work for CAJ, which is the human rights body that co-convenes with Unison on the coalition. And you've probably guessed as well, I'm a feminist, and I also work for pursuit of gender equality and women's place post-conflict in Northern Ireland, which is mostly what I work on there. I'm going to give a really brief overview here of Section 75. I don't want you to think that this is the be-all and end-all of it. If you don't understand it or you want more information, talk to me at lunch, ring me, send me an email, get my details from Clara, because you're probably not going to get it all from these slides. But here we go. Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act. I'm going to tell you a little bit how it works in practice, how it's supposed to be implemented by the public authorities, and then how, if it doesn't work, how you complain about it. And then I'm just going to tell you a little bit about, finally, what the coalition is working on at the moment, and then we'll hand back to Patricia. She'll tell you basically how you can take key learnings from what we know. So a public authority in Northern Ireland must have, under Section 75, due regard to promote equality of opportunity between 9 categories. And these 9 categories are religion, political opinion, race, age, marital status, sexual orientation, gender, persons with and without a disability, and persons with and without dependents. So what the public authority is supposed to do is, Section 75, they're supposed to promote due regard. Then they use Schedule 9 of the Northern Ireland Act, which is the legalities of it all, to put it into their equality scheme so that they can implement the due regard aspect of it. Now,
can I say a wee bit about due regard? Because there's been a whole big debate about what it actually means. There are 2 parts to Section 75 of the Northern Ireland Act. One is about the promotion of equality of opportunity for all of those groups just mentioned, and the other is about basically Catholics and Protestants not liking each other very much, so we need good relations. Now, that's your motherhood and apple pie bit, that's the bit you can throw money at, that's where you can get your wee, oh look, it's a cross-community project bit going without having to change the systemic discrimination. So the reason we fought for the word due regard for the first part of Section 75 is because all the business would be going on the pretend good relations bit, but you can't have good relations in a society riven by discrimination unless you actually start addressing discrimination in the first instance. Otherwise you build on shifting sands. You're not building anything that's real. So due regard, big fight. We'll tell you about where that comes to.
well, to promote the due regard, the designated bodies produce the following things, and this helps them promote equality. They produce an equality scheme, and this is produced around a model scheme that the Equality Commission will put out, and then they can basically change their name and timelines and send it back in, and the Equality Commission then has to approve the scheme before the scheme becomes legally viable. Now, inside the equality scheme will be things like how they're going to consult with people, how they're going to get hard to reach groups like children and young people, how they're going to train their staff in equality, and things like how they're going to screen, which is the most important one, how they're going to screen the revised and new policies that come out. So what they do is internally they monitor their equality scheme and they send a report to the Equality Commission every 5 years, and the Equality Commission monitors their schemes. But in order to support the equality schemes, they often produce equality action plans, and this is where the timelines and outcomes of their equality scheme would be based. Now, a lot of public authorities produce them together and consult on them both, but some don't. But they all have to consult on their equality scheme. Then the third thing they have to do is produce an audit of inequalities. And this audit is really a review and analysis of them and the services that they produce, and how, if they maybe adversely impact on a certain group. So maybe they don't have enough women using their services. How are they going to get more women to use their services? So that's really what the audit of inequalities is supposed to do. So it identifies potential function areas so that they can better discharge their equality duty going forward. It's a little bit complicated, but I get there. They then have equality screening documents, and any new or revised policy that comes out, they have to look at the 9 categories and see if it adversely impacts any of these groups, and it's an equality impact assessment, or EQIA for short. So they have to produce one of these, and this helps. These 5 things help them produce, help them to pay the due regard to the promotion of equality. I'm just going to give you a really brief overview, a very, very simple overview of how they would all come together. So say for instance a government department decides to make some new housing provisions in an area of Belfast. Well, the first thing you're going to think of is it adversely going to impact either Catholics or Protestants, because in Belfast everyone lives in a segregated society. So they'd have to check their audit of inequalities to make sure they have that data. They then screen their proposal to see who it has an equality impact on, or if it has one. They would produce this equality impact assessment, and then they would consult. Now, a lot of them again consult on their EQIA and, for instance, this new housing, and some of them don't. It just depends. But they have to consult on the proposal itself, and that's where NGOs come in. So NGOs and community groups can then help shape this policy by responding to their consultation. Now, the big question is, what happens when all of this or one of these things doesn't happen and they decide that it doesn't have an equality impact? Well, there's a few different things that have to happen. The public authority has a commitment in their equality scheme to make sure that they have a complaints mechanism. So you must always go to the designated body in the first instance. Now, problem is, designated body will more than likely say whatever. So what do you do then? Well, there's the Equality Commission itself has 2 areas that you can take a complaint. First is paragraph 10, but you must be a directly affected person. So this policy or consultation that you have an issue with must directly affect you so that you can take it. And that's hard to do sometimes because of time scales, or due to what the policy is, or just not having all the information. So it is hard to get a complaint through in paragraph 10. Paragraph 11 though is you can draw attention to an issue, and the Equality Commission has the powers to investigate it itself. Now I'm going to talk a wee bit more about that in a minute, but you can say to them that you think that they should investigate this issue, and you don't have to be directly affected. The last thing you could do is take a judicial review on section 75, but as you can imagine, this is limited. It's still possible, but it's a long drawn out process. So that's just a brief overview. You'd have to go to the public authority, say that there was a breach of equality scheme, and then go to the commission. Or you could say that section 75, the public authority didn't pay due regard, and take a judicial review. The only thing, as I've said about judicial review, is timing and resources. It could take 2-3 years to get a decision, and that might just be too long. So this is really just to show you how a couple of complaints that have went to our Equality Commission and how they worked. The first one was a paragraph 10 investigation. Remember, that's the directly affected person. And this was a woman who, believe it or not, was acting up into a position for 10 years, and they never made her permanent. She could go for any other promotions, and she didn't have any terms and conditions, the same as the other staff that were permanent. So that is a direct equality issue for that woman. So the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland ruled that they had no screening on their to look at the adverse impacts on their temporary promotion policy. So then that lady could take a case, and she won her case and ended up with a permanent job and better work conditions. Now, paragraph 11, this is where it gets exciting. Paragraph 11 has only ever been used this once by the Equality Commission, and they've been there for 10 years. So, this one that's been taken is a bus service. It was a town service in a small town that we have in Bangor, County Down, and the town service really facilitated older people going to and from hospital appointments or getting to and from the shops. And it serviced all of the smaller housing estates. But TransLink took it off because they decided they just, there wasn't enough people using it. So the Equality Commission are currently investigating this and awaiting further information before recommendations are going to come out. I would say the recommendations will probably be something like, there needs to be a different service that will service them, or maybe a voluntary service, but we don't know yet. Now, this is where it comes into play. We, as the Equality Coalition, have been looking at the welfare reform, and it's going to impact every single category of equality. It's going to impact all of our 86 members, and the Equality Coalition have decided to defer an investigation into the welfare reform bill. Now, we can't take a directly affected case because we have 86 members and organisations and umbrellas, and there's just too many for that. But we thought they could investigate because they're the investigating body. But no, they've deferred. So instead, they're going to take an investigation into a play park that's named after a hunger striker, because that will help all of the 9 categories. It's crazy.
We estimate 250,000 families impacted in Northern Ireland by the welfare reform benefits, or the welfare reform cuts. Primarily women, primarily children, primarily older people and people with disabilities, and that's what they're going to do instead.
So that just brings me on to the work of the Equality Coalition and what we're really doing at the moment, and it mostly is around welfare reform. But I just wanted to say a few things about what we do. I would encourage members to send around consultation responses, for instance, on the welfare reform bill or any policies that are coming up. And then it means smaller organisations, due to the recession, they might not have any policy workers themselves, means they can share our information and endorse things so they can still have their say, even though they're maybe very small. We would also have engagement meetings with, the equality duty is coordinated across the government departments by the Office of the First Minister and Deputy First Minister's Equality Unit. So we would meet with them on a quarterly basis just to have dialogue between us. And we'd also meet with the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland on a quarterly basis. And we try to theme these meetings. Recently we've talked about health and employment and training and education, but funnily enough it's all come back to welfare reform, so it's just ended up being the same thing. Third thing we do is we have training and capacity, and we try and train our members up in things like how the non-discrimination laws fit with equality, how to better engage with MLAs, how to actually use consultations to benefit you. And then last but not least, what we're doing most at the minute is advocacy and lobbying. And we support all of our members in what they want to do, but then we've also been taking an overarching equality view on the welfare reform bill. So that's really a lot of what our work has been. And then I'm just doing a shameless plug that if you want to know more about us, that's our website. But I must say there is really good training documents on there about Section 75 that you could print out or download for yourselves and take away. And they're one for public authorities, one for individuals, how to take complaints. So that's something you might want to go on and look at. So they're all there for you. And just going to pass back to Patricia, and she'll tell you how you can maybe take some of these learnings that we have.
It's just one slide, but you might be thinking, why would we want that? Well, it works. And one of the things that you need to make it work, and the very first thing is political will. When this law first came on the statute books, it coincided with the first devolved government in the north. I'd been fighting a campaign against the privatisation of hospital workers, which started in the Thatcher era. We were successful in most of it, but we lost some contracts into the private sector. Those contracts were hospital cleaners and hospital caterers, in the 90% women. They'd been privatised. And we convinced with the new devolved government, we convinced the then Minister for Health, Barbara de Bruyn, who was the first ever devolved health minister under this system, to
issue an instruction across the Department of Health and all of the health service using Section 75 to conduct an equality impact assessment of the outsourced services. And she did that, and we were able to go in then with our major database on what had happened over the years and demonstrate that discrimination against the women workers had been compounded, that the quality of service had dropped radically, affecting the patients, and that the only way to put that right was to bring the services back in-house. And it took another 2.5 years, but all of those services came back in-house. So as a consequence of this tool, 1,500, mostly women, came back into the health service. Their pay rates rose, they had sound employment, they were back in a pension scheme. Their conditions changed overnight, the quality of the service rose. They came off minimum wage and 0 hours contracts in most instances, back to where they belonged. So it works effectively with political will. It works effectively if it is mainstream. The whole idea of this law, what we fought for, was a tool that would make government and public service decision making better. That's what it's really about. Can we have better decisions that create that more fair, equal, just society we're looking for? So that we don't have to have the discrimination happen first and then we've got to go to court to get redress. What about we head it all off at the pass and we actually do the right thing in the beginning? And in order to do the right thing in the beginning, you have to genuinely mainstream it into your programme for government and how you do your business and how you make your decisions. And a lot of that means training your people up. Resources. No resources attached to this extraordinary programme. The creation of equality officers, usually one at the level of all the public authorities. If you were very lucky, you got a team of maybe an admin worker as well. That wasn't going to work. That isn't working. You need to really resource this and make it mainstream. Data collection, the kind of stuff that Nat was talking about. The biggest argument politically from our government so far has been you can't equality impact the programme for government, and you can't equality impact the budget because it's too complex. And Louise sat up here and gave us an equality impact on lone parents of the budget. That's hard, like. That's about real data that exists. We're currently being told that you can't produce the equality impact assessment of the proposed welfare benefit cuts on our society because they're not holding data on religion and politics. We could do it for them on the back of an envelope because we know who lives where. They know who's in receipt of benefits. Actually, we do too. It's out there, you know. So that's back to political will again. Genuine engagement. Now what this is about, it was a unique experiment. It was the engagement between the political system making the decisions and the affected groups in society. And it started off with genuinely supermodels of engagement. Health was one of the best one. When they were developing the programme to tackle our horrendous health inequalities, there was wholesale engagement of people out in communities. It was done properly and people got their involvement was direct, and they're great models. But the politicians started to say, this is the tension between participative democracy and representative democracy. And there are many who think that participative democracy is a threat. Well, I live in a world of participative democracy, and I think you do too. And we are no threat. We in fact enrich, in our view, the representative democracy system. But that genuine engagement is stopped. Well, it has more or less stopped now. If you're in Belfast, you'll see a bus going past with a message from the health service telling you that if you ring a number or get onto a website, you can sign up, apparently to be part of some elite consultation group. So the big outreach has translated into that. Strong enforcement body, absolutely essential. Absolutely essential. That was a strong enforcement body for a long time with our total support, and it has taken us a very long time, I have to tell you, to say anything critical about the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland, because we hoped and we hoped and we hoped But what we're now looking at, we believe, is an enforcement body, and this is not about the people who work in it, because they've got some brilliant people inside, but we're looking at an enforcement body that we met recently, and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions said to the Chief Executive and the Chair, why are you adopting the same policy as the DUP? And that is actually where we are at the minute. We've got the same policy on the blocked Single Equality Act. Coalition of interest essential. Build it, build it, build it. You've got an Equality Rights Alliance, you've got the women's movement. We've got all of those. We have two big coalitions in the north. The other one is the Human Rights Consortium, and we're all involved in the CAJ. Established it, and it's got like, I think about 180 organisations inside, and not everybody inside that coalition all believe the same thing. Like, there'll never be agreement in that Human Rights Coalition on abortion and the right to choose. Well, there's total agreement there should be a Bill of Rights. You know, so they're on the issue of a Bill of Rights. In our coalition, we're on the whole heap. So we are likely to get agreement, because that is the nature of the organisations inside. So your coalitions don't all have to think the same way, but there needs to be a common goal that everybody can sign up to. So the wider coalition on human rights will go from churches to trade unions and everybody in between with all sorts of views. The current government and the DUP, Peter Robinson, I'll finish with this. The Congress met Peter Robinson and Martin McGuinness 3 weeks ago, and we did first item on the agenda, the economy, the UK budget had just happened. Useful discussion. Next item on the agenda, equality and human rights. Stops being a useful discussion. We set out the stall on why we are saying it's absolutely imperative that the missing commitments in the Good Friday Agreement are met. Martin McGuinness responds by saying, on the same page as the trade unions. Peter Robinson says, I don't know what page you're talking about. The First Minister for Northern Ireland then tells us, in no uncertain terms, that he does not support the Good Friday Agreement. His party is not in favour of all of the anti-discrimination laws, highlights in particular the law on sexual orientation, tells us bluntly there will be no Bill of Rights. And despite the fact that the Human Rights Consortium has polled the electorate in the north, and 93% of DUP voters are in favour of a Bill of Rights and social and economic rights in particular, and they identify health, social care, housing and education in their top four, we're told that they were asked the wrong question. So we've got a big difference in our society between how ordinary people think and how the people they vote for are behaving. And we're at a very critical stage in our evolution, but again, on the same mission. I think the whole island is at a very critical stage in its evolution. You know, I was the president of Congress. For 2 years, I came into office when there was a big boom and everybody was doing very nicely, and I'm going, I left the presidency at the point of economic collapse. I think that's probably on my tombstone, you know, it wasn't my fault. But all the way through that boom, there was lip service to equality. On human rights, a lot more reservation on the issue of human rights. And now we're in a place where this society really needs the tools of equality and human rights. If a very significant section of our population in both jurisdictions does not go under, and in the north, in the middle of a peace process, we have people dying from inequality. And that is a preventable cause. And it's a preventable cause right across this island. And so therefore, go for it.